All right, today we are tackling something huge, one of the most game-changing events of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution. Now, this isn't just a story about battles and protests. Nope. It's really a story about how a powerful idea, something cooked up in books and whispered about in secret meetings, could literally bring a massive, centuries-old empire crashing down. So let's start with the big question, right? How can a single idea, just a concept, spark a revolution and completely redraw the map of the world? I mean, think about it. Now, this is the Paris Commune of 1871. It was this incredibly radical uprising that, yeah, it got crushed. But for socialists at the time, this was a massive deal. It was like a sneak peek, a little glimpse into the future they wanted to build, a world run by workers. But here's the thing. To really get the Russian Revolution, we can't start in Russia. We actually have to rewind a few decades and look at all of Europe, because the whole continent was basically a giant pressure cooker, just simmering with unrest and creating the perfect storm for some really radical changes. And this image right here, it just perfectly captures the new reality for millions of people. You see, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, pulling tons of people into these booming, overcrowded cities. But for this new working class, well, it meant crazy long hours, terrible pay, and just grim living conditions. I mean, look at that. Unemployment was everywhere, and you can just feel the desperation building. And at the exact same time, you've got another ingredient in this explosive mix. The French Revolution had totally let the genie out of the bottle, politically speaking. These brand new, radical ideas about freedom, equality, and individual rights were just spreading like wildfire. So you've got this perfect storm brewing, right? A huge population suffering in these awful new conditions, and now they're armed with powerful new ideas about how the world should work. It was a collision course, for sure. So out of this clash of misery and hope, all these different visions for a new society started popping up. People began to rally around different isms, political ideologies, and each one was promising a fix for all the problems they saw. So let's take a look at the main players. Okay, so on one side you had the liberals. Now, they wanted change, but it was, let's call it change light. They were all for having a representative government, but, and this is a big but, they thought only men who owned property should get to vote. Then you had the radicals. They were like, no way. They wanted a real democracy, a government for the majority. And get this, a lot of them were even pushing for the super revolutionary idea of letting women vote. Big difference. But the most explosive idea of them all, that was socialism. Socialists looked at the factories, the slums, all of it, and they came to this absolutely stunning conclusion. The real problem wasn't the king or the government, it was the whole idea of private property. They argued that as long as a few people owned all the factories and all the land, they would always put their own profits ahead of the well-being of the workers, and this idea was about to get a major, major boost. And that boost came from this guy, Karl Marx. He basically gave this socialist idea a super powerful instruction manual. He said, look, industrial society, what he called capitalism, is just one big fight. It's a fight between the owners, the capitalists, who have all the money and factories, and the workers who do all the work. And here's the kicker. Marx said that the profit the owners make is basically stolen from the workers. It's the extra value their labor creates. So what was the solution? Well, according to Marx, there was only one. The workers had to rise up, overthrow the whole system, and build a brand new socialist society where everything, the factories, the land, you name it, was owned by everyone. Okay, so now let's finally turn to Russia, because while all these ideas are swirling around Europe, Russia is basically becoming the perfect, let's call it a laboratory for revolution. It was this massive, old-school empire, ruled by an all-powerful czar, and it was just completely teetering on the brink. And I mean, just look at this contrast. It says it all, doesn't it? On one hand, you've got Tsar Nicholas II, an autocrat with absolute total power. And on the other hand, this. This was the reality for 85% of the people, peasants and factory workers, sleeping in shifts in these crowded bunkers, eating whatever scraps they could get. They couldn't even live with their own families. They had zero rights, zero respect. Just a massive, massive divide. And then a series of shocks just hammered this already fragile system, one after another. In 1905, you have Bloody Sunday, where soldiers literally opened fire on peaceful protesters. That sparked a revolution, but it was brutally crushed. Then, 1914, Russia jumps into World War I, and it is an absolute catastrophe. We're talking millions of casualties, and the economy just completely collapses. By 1916, people are literally starving in the cities, and riots for bread are breaking out everywhere. The whole thing is just a ticking time bomb. And that brings us to the big one, 1917. By this point, the Russian Empire was basically a house of cards, ready to fall over in a stiff breeze. And in this one single year, it's going to get blown down, not once, but twice. So, the first revolution kicks off in February, and it all starts with women textile workers walking out, striking for bread in the capital. More and more people join them, and then comes the critical moment. The soldiers are ordered to shoot the protesters, and they refuse. They actually turn around and join the revolution. The Tsar completely loses control, and he's forced to abdicate. Just like that, centuries of monarchy, gone. And in its place, you get these new democratic bodies popping up, councils of workers and soldiers called Soviets. A temporary government tries to take charge, but honestly, the chaos just gets worse. And right into this massive power vacuum steps this guy, Vladimir Lenin. He's the leader of the most radical socialist group, the Bolsheviks. He gets back from exile in April and just immediately drops a bombshell on everyone with his April theses. He's basically saying, we are not waiting around. His demands were so simple but so powerful. He promised the people peace, land, and bread. Get out of the war, give land to the peasants, and hand over all power to the Soviets. He was calling for a second revolution, a socialist one, and he wanted it now. And you know what? People listened. The Bolsheviks' popularity just exploded over the summer, leading to these huge street demonstrations. But the government wasn't just going to roll over. They fought back. This picture shows what happened in July, an attempted uprising that was met with bullets. The government cracked down hard. They arrested a bunch of Bolshevik leaders, and Lenin himself had to flee and go back into hiding. For a minute there, it really looked like their chance was gone. But it wasn't. By October, the government was weaker than ever, and Lenin, still in hiding, was convinced it was now or never. He told the Bolsheviks, get ready to take power. And on the night of October 24th, they did. It was incredibly fast and incredibly organized. A special military committee directed troops to seize all the key points in the city: the post office, the train stations, government buildings. They arrested the government ministers. And by the next day, it was over. The city belonged to them, and the socialists were in charge. So they'd won the revolution. Great. But now came the really hard part. The monumental, almost impossible task of actually building a brand new world from the ashes of the old one. This was way more than just swapping out a few leaders. They wanted to fundamentally rewire the entire country. The Bolsheviks, who now call themselves the Communist Party, set out to build the world's very first socialist state. And it was a project that was going to be both incredibly visionary and incredibly brutal. And you really get a sense of that vision from posters like this one. For them, factories and smokestacks, that was the symbol of progress. That was socialism in action. It was the only way to build a modern, powerful country that could take care of everybody. And they used art like this to sell that dream of a new world, built by everyone, for everyone. But that dream had a really, really dark side. And this is where you see those big, abstract ideas we talked about turning into terrifying reality. Take farming. They forced this policy called collectivization on the peasants. The idea was to create these huge, state-run farms. But to do it, they had to seize land from the more well-off peasants, who they labeled kulaks and called enemies of the people. And this poster just says it all. It literally says, we shall strike at the kulak. It just lays bare the violence that was at the heart of this transformation. So yeah, the changes they made were radical, and they happened fast. They put their theory right into practice. Private property? Gone. All the banks and major industries were nationalized. Russia became a one-party state, and if you criticized the government, you'd have to deal with the new secret police, the Cheka. Unsurprisingly, all this kicked off a horrible, brutal civil war. You had the Bolshevik Reds fighting the Whites, who were really just a mixed bag of everyone who hated the Bolsheviks. And the Whites got help from countries like Britain, France, and the US, who were all completely terrified that socialism was going to spread. Now, even with all this chaos and bloodshed happening inside Russia, the revolution was sending massive shockwaves all around the world. I mean, think about it. For the very first time in history, a state run by and for workers actually existed, and the rest of the world had to figure out what on earth to do about it. And for a lot of people, it was incredibly inspiring. It just fired up the imaginations of socialists and activists everywhere. This journal cover from India is a great example. All across the colonized world, people fighting for independence looked at the new Soviet Union and saw a model for their own struggles. And the Bolsheviks leaned into this hard. They created something called the Comintern, an international organization designed to help start communist revolutions everywhere, trying to make socialism a truly global movement. So when we look back at it all, what's the final verdict? Well, it's just incredibly complicated. Its legacy is a complete contradiction. On the one hand, you can't deny the achievements. The Soviet Union took a poor, underdeveloped country and turned it into a global superpower. It built up industry, it modernized farming, and it did try to feed the poor. But, and this is a huge but, it did all of that by crushing basic human freedoms. Development came through repression, and millions of people paid the ultimate price. It's the terrifying example of what happens when you decide the end justifies any means. And that really leaves us with the big, difficult question, doesn't it? The revolution started with this beautiful promise, a utopia of equality, a paradise for workers. But what it created was one of the most repressive systems the world has ever seen. So the challenge for us, looking back, is to try and figure that out. How did a dream of a perfect world lead to such a nightmare? And what does that tell us about the incredible power and the incredible danger of big revolutionary ideas?
So, how does a modern, educated, sophisticated nation just fall into unimaginable darkness? It's one of history's most terrifying questions. And to even begin to understand it, we're not going to start with a big historical overview. No, we're going to start with the story of an 11-year-old boy and a single, terrifying conversation that changed his life forever. Okay, so picture this. It's the spring of 1945. Germany has just lost the war. An 11-year-old boy named Helmuth is at home, and he overhears his father, who's a prominent doctor, say these chilling words to his mother. He's not just talking about losing a battle. He's talking about a very specific and very terrifying kind of payback. The very next day, Helmut's father took his own life. And the boy, he was so traumatized by what he'd heard that for the next 9 years, he refused to eat a single meal at home. He was terrified his own mother might poison him. It's a shocking story, right? And to understand that father's terror, we have to rewind the clock, all the way back to the end of the First World War. You see, the story of Nazi Germany, well, it doesn't just begin with Hitler. It really begins in the ashes of Imperial Germany. After 4 incredibly brutal years of war, the nation was defeated, their emperor was gone, and the country was left completely reeling, both psychologically and financially. This is what that defeat looked like on a map. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was seen by so many Germans not as a peace deal, but as a deep national humiliation. It literally carved up their country, stripping away vital land and resources. And the scale of these terms, it was just staggering. Germany lost 13% of its territory and every single one of its overseas colonies. But the punishment went even deeper, forcing it to give up 3/4 of its iron and over 1/4 of its coal. And on top of all that, they were handed a bill for £6 billion in war reparations. For many Germans, this wasn't just a treaty. It felt like a national wound, and that resentment poisoned their politics for years. And if that national humiliation wasn't bad enough, what came next was a wave of economic disasters that brought the country to its knees and pushed its people to the absolute brink. Now look at this image. It's wild, right? It perfectly captures this thing called hyperinflation. To pay off its debts, the government's brilliant idea was to just print more money. The result? The German mark became basically worthless. This picture of people using wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread, it became infamous around the world. Just let that number sink in for a second. By December of 1923, it took over 98 million marks to equal a single US dollar. Your entire life savings? Wiped out. Poof! Gone! Overnight! The entire economic foundation of society had just crumbled into dust. And just when it seemed like things were starting to stabilize, bam! The 1929 Wall Street crash hits, plunging the whole world into the Great Depression. And Germany? It got hit the hardest. Industrial production just collapsed. The number of unemployed people shot up to an incredible 6 million. These images, they capture that feeling of utter desperation on the streets. People lost everything, their jobs, their homes, and maybe worst of all, their hope. So you've got this perfect storm, right? Humiliation, fear, total desperation, and it's into this chaos that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party step onto the scene offering radical, simple, and very powerful answers. Check out this timeline. It's absolutely mind-blowing. In 1928, the Nazis were a tiny fringe party, getting less than 3% of the vote. Just 4 years later, right in the middle of the Depression, they become the largest political party in Germany. So how on earth did that happen? Well, for one thing, they were masters of propaganda that promised a better future. Hitler understood political spectacle like no one else. These weren't just political meetings. They were huge, theatrical rallies with seas of flags and torches, all designed to create this overwhelming feeling of unity and strength for people who felt broken. And at the center of it all was Hitler, a really powerful and passionate speaker. He promised to rip up the Versailles Treaty, rebuild the military, get people back to work, and bring back German pride. He gave people a scapegoat for all their problems and sold them a vision of a powerful, reborn nation. So, once they're in power, Hitler and the Nazis move fast to tear down democracy and start building a new society based on the horrifying core of their ideology.
You see, at the very heart of Nazism was a complete rejection of the idea that all people are equal. It was all built on this twisted, fake science of race. In their worldview, pure Germans, who they called Aryans, were the master race at the top. And everyone else, especially Jewish people, were labeled as inferior or undesirable and simply had no place in their new Germany.
And the terrifying part is, what came next wasn't just random violence. No, it was a cold, calculated, and methodical process. It happened in 3 distinct stages that led from persecution all the way to mass murder. So, step 1, exclusion. This began almost right away. New laws stripped Jewish people of their citizenship. They were banned from their jobs, their businesses were boycotted, and they were segregated from public life in these really mundane but cruel ways, just like this sign on a park bench. And that's how the unthinkable starts to become normalized. One law, one sign, one act of exclusion at a time. From exclusion, it moved to ghettoization, and then, finally, to annihilation. This image is just haunting. It shows just a fraction of the shoes taken from victims at a death camp. It really gives you a sense of the industrial scale of the killing. Millions, 6 million Jews, and millions of others were systematically murdered. Which brings us right back to where we started. Back to that 11-year-old boy in 1945 listening in on his father's terrified confession. So now, with all of this context, we can finally understand what was behind his fear. He wasn't just afraid of being on the losing side of a war. No, his terror was way deeper and far more personal than that. And here's the answer. Helmut's father, the physician, had been a Nazi. He was a part of the system. He knew exactly what the regime had done. The mass murder, the horrific medical experiments, the genocide. His fear wasn't of enemy soldiers, it was of justice. He was terrified of being held accountable for his role in what the world would soon call crimes against humanity. You know, the story of how a nation of poets and thinkers became a nation of murderers is a profound warning for all of us. It forces us to ask ourselves, what are the conditions that allow extremism to take root? And what are the warning signs that we should never, ever ignore?
Have you ever looked around you, at your desk, a piece of paper, even the rubber on your shoes, and wondered about the story behind it? Well, that story is all tied up with the history of the world's forests, and a massive, often brutal change in how we even think about them. Today, we're going to uncover that hidden history. So, let's kick this off with a question for you. What on earth could your desk possibly have in common with a giant warship from the British Royal Navy? I know, it sounds like a bit of a stretch, right? Well, the answer is wood. But we're not just talking about any wood. This is about a very specific demand for timber that just exploded. It became so huge, so relentless, that it would end up completely reshaping ecosystems and entire societies all across the globe. To really get this, we've got to go back in time, to an era when empires weren't built on oil or data, but were literally built on wood. And this incredible non-stop demand created a massive conflict over what a forest even is. Okay, so this is what it all boils down to. On one side, you have the villagers. For them, a forest was everything. It was their supermarket, their pharmacy, their hardware store. It was this rich, diverse mix of all kinds of trees and plants that gave them food, fuel, medicine, you name it. But on the other side, you have the colonial state. And when they looked at a messy, natural forest, they didn't see a home. They saw wasted space. They saw a resource that needed to be tamed and managed for one thing, and one thing only: tall, straight, commercially valuable trees like teak and saw. So you gotta ask, right, why this crazy, insatiable demand for wood? Well, it came down to 2 major things. First, the Royal Navy. See, by the 1800s, England was literally running out of its own oak trees, the very wood it needed for its warships. And let's be clear, without a powerful navy, there is no British Empire. But the second reason was even bigger: the railway boom. Think of railways as the arteries of the empire, the lifeblood needed to move goods, raw materials, and, crucially, troops across these vast new territories. And when we say railways needed a lot of wood, that's an understatement. Get this. For every single mile of track they laid, they needed somewhere between 1,760 and 2,000 wooden planks, or sleepers, to hold the rails down. Just let that sink in. Up to 2,000 trees for just 1 mile of track. And this picture, wow, it just perfectly captures the sheer industrial scale of it all. This wasn't a couple of guys with axes. This was a massive, highly organized operation. They used elephants to haul these enormous logs out of the deep forest, all to feed the ever-expanding empire. And just look at this timeline. The growth was just explosive. It all kicks off in the 1850s. By 1890, there's already 25,500 kilometers of track in India. Fast forward to 1946, and that number has ballooned to over 765,000 kilometers. The result? The forests that stood in the path of this progress, they just started to vanish. So if you're the colonial government, you're watching your most critical resource disappear before your eyes. You need a solution, right? You need to guarantee a permanent supply of wood. Well, their answer had this very impressive sounding name, scientific forestry. But don't let the name fool you. I mean, it sounds good, right? Scientific. But this had nothing to do with ecology. This was all about industrial efficiency. The idea was simple. Clear-cut the natural, biodiverse forests, and in their place, plant a single, valuable type of tree in perfectly straight rows. It wasn't a forest anymore. It was basically a timber factory. And wow, you can really see the difference here, can't you? On the left, that's a natural forest. It's complex, it's messy, it's teeming with life. And on the right, that's a plantation. It's orderly, uniform, and from the government's point of view, perfect. But for the actual ecosystem, and for all the people who relied on it, it was an absolute disaster. Now, to enforce this whole new system, you need new rules. So they passed laws like the Indian Forest Act of 1878, and what it did was it sliced up the forests into 3 categories. The best ones, the most valuable ones, were called reserved forests, and for villagers, they were completely locked out. You couldn't take so much as a fallen twig. For their basic needs, they were pushed into the lower quality protected or village forests. It was, plain and simple, a systematic takeover of their land. And, this wasn't just about trees. This brings us to the really devastating human cost of all this. For the millions of people whose entire lives were interwoven with these forests, these changes were nothing short of catastrophic. This petition from the Bega community, man, it just says everything. All of a sudden, their traditional ways of life, things they had done for centuries, were banned. Their access to food, to fuel, to everything they needed to survive was just cut off. They were left with nothing. This wasn't some minor inconvenience. For so many, it was a death sentence. And this is what it looks like on the ground. A simple, everyday act of survival, like a woman gathering firewood to cook for her family, was suddenly a crime. People were forced to literally steal from the same forests that had sustained their ancestors for generations. And if they got caught, they were at the mercy of forest guards who could demand bribes or whatever else they wanted. And this is where it gets really outrageous. While local people were forbidden from hunting for food, the colonial state was actively paying people to kill big predators. Why? Because they saw animals like tigers and wolves as signs of a savage wilderness that needed to be tamed. Just look at these numbers. Between 1875 and 1925, rewards were paid for killing 80,000 tigers, 150,000 leopards, and 200,000 wolves. It's just unbelievable. Yeah, this wasn't about safety. Big game hunting became a sport, a status symbol. And this picture, it just sums up the whole contradiction, doesn't it? If you were a villager hunting to feed your family, you were a criminal. But if you were a colonial official hunting for a trophy, you were a hero. But you can't just impose something like this and expect people to take it lying down. They didn't. All across the colonial world, these oppressive forest laws sparked fierce resistance, rebellion, and a legacy of conflict that continues to this day. And you know what's really interesting? This wasn't just a British thing in India. It was a pattern. Look over in Java, which was controlled by the Dutch. It's the exact same playbook. They wanted teak for their ships, they brought in their own version of scientific forestry, and they kicked the locals out. And just like in India, the people resisted. And the ways people fought back were just incredible, so creative. In Java, this one man, Soren Tycho Salmon, came up with this brilliant philosophical challenge. He basically said, look, the state didn't create the wind, the water, or the wood, so how can it own them? and his followers just refused to pay taxes or work for the Dutch. I mean, how do you argue with that logic? Then, in other places, like Bastar in India, the rebellion was much more direct, people burning down police stations and raiding the homes of officials. So, where does that leave us today? Well, the story doesn't end there. It's taken a long, long time, but governments and conservationists are finally starting to realize what these forest communities knew all along. These top-down, we-know-best policies, they just don't work. If you want to protect a forest, you have to work with the people who actually live there. So I think the big takeaway here is this. The forests we look at today, they aren't some untouched, pristine wilderness. They are landscapes that have been fundamentally shaped by history, by the needs of shipbuilders and railway engineers from centuries ago. And that leaves us with one last really important question. An empire's needs reshape these forests once. What forces and whose needs are shaping them today?
Imagine a life that isn't defined by a single place, but by the journey itself. A world that's constantly in motion, happening just beyond our settled view. Well, this is the world of nomadic pastoralists, and for centuries, their story has been written on the move.
For hundreds and hundreds of years, these communities have moved with their herds, following this ancient rhythm that's just dictated by the seasons. They're chasing the green grass, going up to high mountain pastures in the summer and then coming back down to the foothills for the winter. It's like a masterclass in reading the land and living in perfect harmony with it. And that right there is the core of what we're exploring today. This isn't just a story about a traditional way of life. No, it's about a massive clash between these ancient, fluid traditions and a modern world that demands fixed borders, new laws, and a totally different way of seeing the land. To really get how this works, let's start in the mountains and plains of India. Because here, these pastoral cycles were perfected into what was basically a sustainable art form, a life lived in perfect sync with the environment.
Just look at the pure logic of this annual cycle. For the Gaudy shepherds of Himachal Pradesh, this journey was a brilliant survival strategy. They would spend the winter down in the low hills, and then, as the snows melted, they'd march north to spend the summer in these beautiful high mountain meadows. This constant movement meant their flocks always had rich pasture, but it also gave the grasslands time to recover. It was a perfectly balanced, healthy ecosystem.
And this incredible adaptation wasn't just for the mountains. Not at all. In the harsh deserts of Rajasthan, communities like the Raikas perfected their own rhythm. They actually combined herding with a bit of cultivation. When the monsoon pastures dried up around October, they'd move out, searching for food and water for their camels and sheep, and they'd only come back when the rains returned.
Now, this is really important. These weren't isolated communities. They were a vital part of the wider economy. Take the Dangars in Maharashtra, for example. During the dry season, they traveled to the fertile Konkan coast. Their flocks would graze on the harvested fields, which perfectly manured the soil for the next crop. And in return, the local farmers gave them rice, a grain they couldn't grow back on the dry plateau. It was a perfect, symbiotic relationship. So this was absolutely not random wandering. It was a highly sophisticated system. They had to know exactly how long to stay in one place, where the next water source was, and how to negotiate passage with all the different farming communities. Their entire world was built on this deep ecological knowledge and really complex social networks. And then, everything changed. The arrival of British colonial rule imposed a completely new, rigid logic on the land, one that just had no room for movement. This new order would pretty quickly begin to dismantle the pastoralists' entire world. You see, the colonial state saw the land through a totally different lens. This was a fundamental clash of worldviews. On one side, you have a life based on mobility and using the land in cycles. On the other, a world built on staying put and private ownership. So on cultivated grazing land, they labeled it wasteland and just gave it away to generate tax revenue. Forests that were full of food for the animals, they were declared reserved for timber, locking the pastoralists out. And the nomads themselves, they were seen as suspicious, even classified as criminal tribes back in 1871, which meant their movements were severely restricted. And to top it all off, a grazing tax was slapped on every single animal they owned. This quote from a colonial forest officer just perfectly captures the official mindset. Grazing was seen as illegitimate. To them, the only legitimate use of a forest was for commercial timber. This worldview simply couldn't get its head around the sustainable way pastoralists had used these lands for centuries.
The consequences, well, they were devastating. Suddenly, huge grazing grounds just disappeared. Pastoralists were forced onto smaller and smaller patches of land. Of course, this led to overgrazing, which led to a decline in the quality of the pastures, which led to a deterioration of their animal stock. For so many of them, it was a complete catastrophe.
But this story wasn't just happening in India. The exact same patterns of closing off land, restricting movement, and creating a crisis, well, they were playing out for pastoral communities half a world away, all across the vast continent of Africa.
Africa is home to over half of the world's pastoral population. We're talking more than 22 million people. To really understand their story, we're going to zoom in on one of the most well-known groups, the Maasai people of Kenya and Tanzania.
Just look at that number for a second. In the late 19th century, European powers literally sliced up Africa. The result for the Maasai? They lost about 60% of their traditional pre-colonial lands. 60%. Gone.
The contrast here is just stark. Before colonialism, Moss Island was this huge open territory. Afterwards, an international boundary cut their land in half. Their best grazing areas were taken for white settlement or turned into famous game reserves like the Serengeti, where they were totally forbidden to enter. They were pushed into this small, dry zone with unreliable rain and really poor pastures.
And this is what happens when you take away the ability to move. Traditionally, pastoralists survived drought by moving to find forage, but confined to a reserve, they were trapped. And the result was horrifying. In 1930, the Kenyan Maasai had about 720,000 cattle. After really bad drought in 33 and 34, over half of them died. They just couldn't escape.
This gut-wrenching quote from herders in Namibia, it says it all. This wasn't just an economic problem, it was an existential one. Their entire world had been enclosed. They felt like they were in jail, cut off from lands their people had used for generations. A whole way of life was being suffocated by invisible lines on a map.
But here's the thing about pastoralists. They are masters of adaptation. So despite these immense pressures, they didn't just vanish. They found ways to survive, to respond, and to carve out a place in this new, restrictive world.
And their responses were incredibly varied and resourceful. Some just reduced their herd sizes. Others, like the Raikas in India, pioneered entirely new migration routes when political partition blocked their old ones. A lot of them started combining herding with trade or wage labor. The wealthier ones actually bought land and settled down, while others started organizing politically, demanding their rights and government support.
This image just captures their new reality perfectly, doesn't it? An ancient way of life, symbolized by the shepherd and his flock, now navigating the concrete and steel of the modern world. It's such a powerful symbol of both the challenges they face and their incredible resilience.
So the key takeaway here is that pastoralism isn't some romantic, outdated lifestyle. In fact, many ecologists now recognize that in really dry and mountainous regions where farming is almost impossible, mobile pastoralism is often the most ecologically sustainable way to live.
And this leaves us with a final thought. We've seen pastoralists as people whose world was disrupted, but maybe we should see them as something more. As we all face our own environmental challenges, maybe there are profound lessons we can learn from these original masters of adaptation. Communities who perfected the art of living lightly on the land and understanding the deep rhythms of nature. The question is, are we ready to listen?